Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving problems. And folks, you're probably tired of hearing me say it, but it's still my favorite thing to say. I know Camden knows what I'm saying already. Today is one of my favorite shows because when I get to introduce a brother from the regiment, that is always my top notch favorite thing to do and have as a guest on the show. And Scott Mann is joining us. Scott, how you doing today,
Hey
brother?
Otis, thanks for having me on, buddy. Good to see you.
Oh, it's great seeing you, and I am excited because I've been thinking about this question all morning, man. And my thought is, where did this story come? And so folks, I'm going to do a little teaser. Scott wrote a play called Last Out, but I'm going to back up because I want to know where this storytelling drive. I mean,
Yeah.
because writing a book that's an okay thing, but to tell a story as a play, where'd that come from,
Well, I
man?
think you can probably appreciate this. Really, my parents and my grandparents. I'm a child of Appalachia, and storytelling runs very, very deep there. And I always had an appreciation and an affinity for the stories that my grandfather would tell around the campfire when we were bear hunting or just walking in the woods. And I, at a very early age, I learned this thing called narrative transportation, where someone could tell a story well, and all of a sudden, I'm running around with my papa when he was 12 years old and doing all of his adventures, and it's as if I'm living it myself. It was literally, it induces a trance. And as I moved through special forces and deployed all over Central and South America and Southwest Asia, I saw amazing Green Berets like yourself use storytelling in those situations where even in the most trust depleted places, you could a great storyteller could paint a vision of what might be if locals stood up on their own. So, I mean, I had the greatest gift in the world is that I was around all these amazing human beings who were wonderful storytellers. And I don't think I ever had a chance. Like, I fell in love with it at such an early age. But it was really when I got out of the service and was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up that I really decided to pursue storytelling, not as a profession, because I don't think there's such a thing. More like you as a lifetime learner.
How do you make that jump from talking around the campfire and that type of thing? Because that's something that a lot of people can relate to. I think there's a lot of people that are like really good, like natural storytellers, natural comedians, that type of thing from those environments. Yeah. But then making the jump to, on a stage, like that's a whole nother level of production there. How did you make that jump?
Yeah, it really is, Camden, and I think that's a great question. I will tell you, honestly, my transition from the military was really bad. I mean, I want to say that right out of the gate. I had a bad transition. It did not go the way that I wanted it to go, although everything on the surface seemed great. I had a good job. My kids were still at home. My wife and I were still married. I mean, I was retiring on my terms. But I went through a lot of, I think now, things that I know that other people went through, but loss of identity, loss of purpose, and a lot of the things like the survivor's guilt and stuff that I had pushed down for years just came screaming in. The point of all that is it took me to a dark place where I almost checked out, and it was the grace of God that I didn't. Some things happened in my life that pulled me away from that, but I also met a mentor who was a pro football player turned storyteller turned actor and playwright named Bo Eason. And when I watched him speak from the stage, man, I was kind of looking for what I was going to do next. I watched Bo, and he didn't walk on the stage. He prowled on the stage, literally like a predator. He moved with such physicality, and I thought, man, like that is amazing. And nobody in the room moved. He literally owned the room the entire time he was there. And I thought, that's what I've got to do. Like whatever it is he's doing, that's what I'm meant to do next. And so I trained with him for years and trained in the science and the art of storytelling. And what I learned in that camp was that there's, all humans are storytellers. We all put a six pack in our hand and we can tell you a story all day long. But there's also a certain level of skill that you can go to the next level on your storytelling that people are hungry for in this time of low trust. And that's what I trained on, and I just fell in love with as a craft. And it's yeah. So for me, it was a journey through a really dark period to see how storytelling could heal myself and could bridge that civil military gap with others, and I fell in love with it.
Do you think that
I wanna-
Go ahead, Dad.
Okay, Kim, go ahead. Well, all right, because I got something I want to dig into because it's personal to me too, and we grew up as quiet professionals.
Yeah.
And coming out of that shell, and with all the guys that I've worked with over the years, that's a huge hurdle that we have to do. And that shell is also part of the problem, that you hit that dark space.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned Bo.
Yeah.
What were the action steps? Because that's what it really comes down to is
Right.
You can feel it, but what's the action steps that we can do?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Otis. And I think the first thing, and I always take this one on head on, and it's a kind of a two-part thing. But first of all, I think if we're not careful as special operators leaving the military, we can quietly professionalize ourselves right out of existence. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because if you really step back and look at the term quiet professional, to me, what it embodies and what it stands for is what we're supposed to do while we wear the uniform, what we're supposed to do while we represent the regiment, which is for the rest of our life, being a quiet professional. But nowhere in the moniker of quiet professional does it say you shouldn't be a storyteller or a leader or a coach or a public influencer. I mean, if you think about it, it's exactly what we did when we were Green Berets and when we were Rangers. We were overtly leading. And yes, we were quiet about it. And in that we were not boastful and we were not, we didn't make it our own agenda. I mean, like we served others. But I think this whole definition of quiet professional has been bastardized to our detriment. And it's almost like it's evolved to mean shut the hell up when you get out of service and just don't make a scene. And I don't buy that. I mean, if you look at the case our nation is in today, if you look at the lack of leadership, I mean, what would have happened on August 15th, 2021, when Afghanistan collapsed, if a whole bunch of veterans would have said, you know what, I'm a quiet professional, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to roll with it. I don't know. I think that's the first thing, is to recognize that definition probably needs revisiting in the context of your own life. And the second thing that I would just say is, when you think about being a storyteller, it doesn't matter what your vocation is or you could be a teacher, you could be a public speaker, you could be working in the corporate world or running a nonprofit. Storytellers for 70,000 years have been the most relevant people in the room because they can transport the audience into a narrative where they are influenced in an authentic way. It's what we're actually designed to do. And what I say to people who tell me, like, look, I don't like to talk about myself, I'm a quiet professional, I always say, hey man, being a storyteller has nothing to do with you, right? You are a vessel, you are a vehicle. Stories are told in the service of the other party. Stories are told. That's the difference between a speaker and a storyteller. A speaker is up there for themselves. A storyteller tells stories to serve others so that they can autobiographically listen and locate themselves in that story and make meaning out of their own existence through someone else's narrative. That's the most generous thing a leader can do. So I know that was a really long answer. And as far as the steps, I would just say, one is we got to get clear on what it means to be a quiet professional. And then is really start to dig into what storytelling is and look at it in its raw form. And it really comes down to being able to design a well-structured story and to be able to deliver it with the kind of impact that the other party locates themselves in your story. And if you can do that, you can do so much good in the world. And it has nothing to do with being, in fact, you can be a quiet professional at the highest level.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the storytelling, because it goes back 70,000 years. It's so innate to us, and I think so much of like what you're talking about there, of like the downsides of being the quiet professional, is the story that you're telling yourself about what that means. So, and I think that's
Right.
that's a really interesting thing, because then, Scott, I mean, the next step there from what you were saying to to me logically is then, well, guys like you two need to help to retell that story or continue that story in a way that guys can still see themselves in it, but then in a more positive light.
So well said. I mean, that's why I founded the Hero's Journey, our nonprofit that helps war fighters, first responders, and all of our families find their voice and tell their story, because more than ever we need storytellers who can bridge that civil military gap, because most of our lived experiences in, as you were saying, Camden, like in the regiment and in combat, there's these amazing experiences that transcend into the civilian world and have a lot of relevance. But the only way, if you put your hands on your hips and traveling Overwatch and you're like, hey, this is what you need to do, in a low trust society, that doesn't work. But if you can tell a story about what your lived experience was and how it affected you, and particularly if it's around struggle and how you overcame it and how you moved through it, then all of a sudden you become extremely relatable to people's pain and relevant to their goals. And that's what people follow. And I'll just give you a quick example. But I just, so we're doing this play Last Out where we travel around the country, and it's all veterans and military family members on the stage, and we tell stories, but it's in the form of a play. But most of the stories are based on true stories. Well, just recently I got a LinkedIn message from a guy named John, SF guy, and he came to the play in Fayetteville like 2019, and his team had just lost a teammate to suicide. And so he came to the play and was looking for something, but in that story and in that play, he was able to make meaning and find some answers for his own lived experience, for the gaps that he had through the storytelling around Master Sergeant Danny Patton and his battle with mental health. And that's called autobiographical listening. I call it the generosity of scars. When you can repurpose your own struggle in the service of other people and they locate themselves in that narrative, it's the most generous thing we can do. And it's all I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I found not only has it helped me heal and restore, but I found it to be just such a connective way to help other people find their voice. I love it when we trained 9 Gold Star family members this past weekend in storytelling. Holy cow, man. Like, they blew the roof off, and they're all going to do so much good with these stories. Like, they can't wait to get out there and get on the stage and speak to other widows and moms. And yeah, that's as good as it gets for me.
Oh yeah. Man, I'm feeling it right now, and it just makes me wonder. I've kind of a how-to.
Yeah.
When you prep yourself,
Right.
I mean, your pregame. I don't know whether you're taking a rip it before you get out there on stage or what, going old school. But what's your pregame so that you can, like, and my visualization is you got the audience right here in the palm of your hand. That's what every person on stage wants, right? So what's your pregame to get to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and leave it to the SF guy to ask about the pregame, because you know better than anybody, Otis, that preparation determines the outcome of the fight. Preparation determines the outcome of the engagement. And 2/3 of effectiveness in rapport building and influence is preparation. And so how you prepare, whether you're giving a presentation to your boss, or whether you're or telling a story from the stage, or speaking at your daughter's wedding, right? How you get yourself into the storyteller's state is critical. And so here's a couple of things that I would say are essential for that. One is, I call it a leader's recon, is whenever I'm going to speak, it doesn't matter where it is. If it could be in a boardroom, it could be from the stage, it could be in a classroom. I'm going to get into that space ahead of time, and I'm going to do a leader's recon. And for those of you who don't know what that is simply getting near the target area and putting eyes on it yourself. And getting because humans are spatial creatures, all mammals are. So if you ever gone up and done a speech or accepted an award or something, or you do extemporaneous speaking and you've never been in that space before, it feels really awkward. And so you're trying to kind of get your feet under you and get a sense of yourself in that space. And while you're doing that, you kind of look like you don't trust yourself. And so the audience picks up on that nonverbal cue at a semi-conscious level and immediately starts worrying about you. And they're not hearing the ideas you're putting out. They're worried about you. They're not turning on you. They're just worried about you because they're like, oh man, that's too bad. He doesn't trust himself. And so they're waiting to see if you ever start to trust yourself. So the best way to overcome that is to get into the space ahead of time, touch the walls, touch the chairs, get up there where you're going to give your talk and actually go through it, do an AV check, but get in the space and get comfortable in the space. That way, when you go up and take the microphone, it's home territory. You've been there before. That's why, you're basically, my buddy Bo calls it marking your territory. So that's one. Another thing that I think is really helpful before in your pregame is what I call pre-engagement preparation. And this one, if you want, I can send you the link to it for a video. It only takes like 3 minutes. But I actually developed this when I was training 18 alpha candidates in the Q course who had to go into these scenarios with actors and role players, and they were failing left and right. So we needed to bring their state down from fight, flight, or freeze to calm or connect. And so basically it's called pre-engagement prep, and it's 3 things. You do 3 diaphragmatic breaths. So you expand your belly on the inhale, and you squeeze your belly to spine on the exhale. And you do this with your eyes closed. You do that 3 times. Then, very slowly with your eyes closed, you say, I have time. And you do that 3 times. Then you ask yourself 3 questions out loud and you answer them. Who am I? Why am I here? And what do these people need from me? So by asking who you are, you validate your identity before you walk in the room. Very important, knowing who you are. By saying, why am I here? You've clarified your purpose. So you're clear on your goal when you walk in. And then third, and most importantly, I asked what they need from me. So when I walk in the room, I'm not thinking about, the last thought I had was not about, oh, I hope I do well, or I hope I don't look like an idiot up here. My last thought was, again, back to the quiet professional, what do they need from me? And when I walk out, that is a different intention, and people sense it. I'm taking care of the audience. I'm taking care of my boss. I'm not worried about how I'm doing. I'm worried about them. And so those 3 things, and then just do a little bit of stretching and walk in the room. Do that like 3 to 5 minutes before any high stakes engagement. Game changer. So those are my 2 big pre-games. I do some other stuff for the play that's really weird, but we won't go into that.
What I'm curious about in that is just, I guess, kind of what advice do you have for someone who can't do the recon, or they don't? The prep, I think, is one you could squeeze in just about any situation, but the recon itself, like my mind is going straight to, just full disclosure on this, to Saturday playing Cal in LA, my first time coaching in their stadium there. I'm going to be feeling that. I've never been in that stadium before. I've never felt, I don't know where the crowd is. I don't know where the noise is coming from the speakers. Like, there's so many different variables you got me thinking about now. And so when you're in that kind of environment, I know, sorry, I'm not actually stressing out about it, more so just good example. but how do you do that recon how do you replace that recon when you don't have the chance to do it?
So what a good SF NCO taught me, Cam, was that in the absence of being, on site doing a leader's recon, you can always do overhead imagery recon and map recon and all that, right? So, but what he said to me was, you better look real hard and tell me with confidence that you can't get in that area and put your eyes on it ahead of time, because 9 times out of 10 you can. It's just inconvenient. And so I say the same thing to aspiring speakers, storytellers, presenters is, it's hard. I mean, you may have to get creative. You may have to get the secretary to let you in a little early, or you may have to walk in. You may have to slide through the door that's not, don't get arrested. But I guess I'm really not trying to be flippant. I think to the degree that you can get in the space before anybody is there, it is an automatic 10x competitive advantage for influence, if you can. If you can't, you can't. But I would submit to you that 9 times out of 10, with forward thinking, you can. And it's worth it. It's worth it. Like you were just talking about on the coaching front, getting in that space and just standing there and running the narrative in your head with full sensory input, the crowd, the smell, everything. Just let yourself drop into it. Huge competitive advantage in how you show up for the actual thing. And again, I've been doing this a lot of years now, and it's the thing that like people they'll say, "Wow, what are you? How did you do that?" Or and you could try to explain that to them, and they wouldn't get it. But if you do it, it's because of that spatial relationship. We have a relationship with space, and when we get it ahead of time, we feel psychologically safe. And when we feel psychologically safe, people around us feel psychologically safe, and it accelerates connection. That's the key. So again, if you can't get in there, there are other things you can do, but they're not great substitutes.
There's one other aspect of the pregame that I think because of the rugby example it came up, and Dad, we talked about this a few weeks ago, is that first hit that so many people need when it comes to the game of rugby, and a lot of things where it's like you need that wake up call to get out there.
Yeah.
Do you have a solution for that, Scott, or do you think that's something that's kind of just part of it? Maybe in your play world that you still got to get out there, you got to get that first laugh, you got to get that first tear, whatever it is.
I agree with you, and you actually hit on it earlier as we were getting started. Here's what I would say: is I tell people if you are in the business of communicating for a living, again, and a lot of people think, well, okay, speaker or teacher. No. I mean, if you have to communicate with clients and associates, and your livelihood depends on how well you communicate, I think this pertains, and it's this: is to think of your storytelling as a craft, and that's one component, but also is thinking of this thing right here, your body and your voice and your mind, as an instrument. The same way that a Green Beret or a Ranger's carbine is an instrument. And then once you hold that rifle, it becomes one instrument. The way that weapon comes up and comes down, the way a fighter pilot straps, an F-22 on their back, they become an instrument, right? So communications is to think of this thing that God gave us here as an instrument. And, if you watch a musician or anybody who has to perform at a high level, football players, rugby players, you see them skipping across the field, and you're like, why is a grown man skipping across the field? Because he's warming his instrument up, and he knows what works. The body wants to play. Right? The body wants to play. The quickest way to warm the body up to play is to skip. Right? And so that's what the body knows that. Well, the same way with your voice. And so there's a whole series of, I would say, one of the most important things that you can do is that PEP that I gave you, and then just add some voice work in there. You talked about how you had just come on the podcast and hadn't really spoken a lot yet. Having some vocal warm-ups is a great way to walk into the space, and your voice, and not just your voice, but like you're already there. You're ready to go because you've warmed the instrument up. And so a good thing to do is if you're going to give a talk, just go through like the first 3 minutes of your talk before you take the stage or before you stand up in front of your boss. And that can often be enough.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That'll break the jitters. There's no doubt about it. And what I love what you're doing here is you're taking what we've learned over our career in uniform, and you're applying it to the real world. And one of the things that, when I'm working with those guys as they're taking off their uniform is just that. And, one of the things I tell them, and I always love to tell them this to when I'm working with a sergeant major, is tell them that, hey man, you're going to do the hardest thing you've ever done. You're going to take the MDMP that you've been using to put together a plan to send guys into harm's way where they could die. That's easier than turning it back on yourself.
Yeah, that's true.
And I know that because I live that damn near every day. I'm like, I need to do a leader's recon. I need to do mission analysis on that thing. I need to do those things. How are you as you go through that? Because you've done a great job of it sounds wasteful, but this is the right word: commercializing that military expertise going forward.
I believe, well, first of all, all war fighters and military family members and first responders, I believe, have an innate skill set within them that is valuable in the civilian world and, frankly, severely needed. If you look at, like, for example, just trust dynamics in civil society today, it's terrible. But veterans and first responders typically enjoy a level of trust that most people don't have coming out of the gate. So, how do you parlay that into social capital that is lasting and frankly puts you in a position of influence? So I think probably the first thing that I would say to anyone transitioning out, from my perspective, and like you said, taking that world that you lived, is to recognize that there is a civil military gap. There's always going to be, because you are coming from a world. I love the tribe plus purpose because it really personifies the answer. But you are coming from a world that is extremely tribal. And by definition, tribes are honor-based societies, right? So everything's based on honor, whether those are Pashtun tribes, North American tribes, or Marines, right? It's a tribal code that you live by, and at its essence, the collective, the group, is more important than the individual. That's really what tribalism, clans, qualms are all about. And it's all around honor. That's the currency. Okay, so you're going from that world into a world that is literally a different planet. It is the polar opposite. The civilian world is a transactional contract society that is not based on honor. It is based on achievement and individual credit. And it puts the individual above the collective, right? So by definition, you're literally changing planets. And you're going from a tribal society to a contract society, from the collective to the individual. So there is a civil military gap that is massive. And understanding how you bridge that civil military gap and how you find relevance in that new world is, to me, is the essence of, like what you do, what you're doing, Otis. And I think it requires a deep level of introspection and an understanding of who you are as a human and what you're bringing to the table, but it also requires a relatability to that new world and what they need, and then finding a way to bridge that gap. That's where I think storytelling is such a powerful component for warfighters.
So the storytelling component, as far as bridging that gap, I think that makes sense. That's really intuitive to most folks listening. But what I'm curious about is the way you're talking about that transition. Is it almost seems like the focus needs to be on the transition rather than getting rid of the gap, because the systems are too, and at least the way you define them there, the systems seem too different to where it's like you almost got to go through training, learn the language and transition out to it rather than actually connecting the two. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think that's a really astute way to think about it. I think too often what happens is, and this is my observation, is you see a lot of veterans and first responders who come into the civilian world and they rage against it. There's just like this rage against the machine kind of thing, because it is so off-putting, it is so foreign, it is in many ways offensive, because of the fact that it values the individual above the collective. And so everything about it runs fundamentally counter to what we were taught and trained and held to account for decades. And so if you try to change it or rage against it, 9 times out of 10, what ends up happening is you end up severely frustrated and frankly marginalized, and you're put in a corner, which makes it even worse, which makes the resentment even worse. And, I believe it really is the SF approach. It's like going into, a tribal community. You don't go into a tribal community and start talking about how jacked up their dispute resolution system is or how stupid their farming is. You wouldn't do that. It's asinine.
Right.
But yet that's kind of what we do when we go into the civilian world. Like, we kind of rage against it. And I think your point is right, Camden. You're not going to change it. And it doesn't mean that we have to change who we are either. I think that, like I said before, I think that our civil society is hungry for leaders who authentically move through adversity and struggle and can rally people around them and move through hard times. I mean, but we have those innate skills, but we have to figure out the language for it, the grammar, how we establish our relevance and relatability to people very different than us, and move through that. But to me, like, we have that. We have those skills. It's just deciding to do it that way and exercising the patience that it takes to do it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cam and Otis Show. If you're enjoying this conversation, then make sure to share it with other lifelong learners in your life so they can enjoy it too. Stay up to date with the show on Facebook and Instagram at Cam and Otis Show, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you're the first to hear about new episodes and other special content. Now let's get back to the show.
Well, it's recognition that it's no different than going into Bosnia. It's no different than going into Afghanistan. We don't go in there with the same attitude and talk to them in the same way that we talk to each other. Like when we're back in the team room, we change and we adapt to the environment. And I think that's one of the biggest things, the biggest foot stompers out there. And it just reminds me, if something's been burning me for a long time, Scotty, I just got to know, man, the VSO thing, to me, that was just, I mean, I'll be honest. I thought it was the nail on the head, right? Yeah. I mean, I thought that was the solution. Yeah. But it was also an example of how things happen in the military, how things happen in the world. Yeah. Truthfully, in the sense of, you saw this, you created this idea, and you drove it with personal equity to get to the point where we were doing it. I'm just, when you saw what happened after you moved on. Yeah. When you look back on that, what's that? That's got to be a pit. I'm just guessing.
It is. To be honest with you, it's the essence of the play. You know, the play is really about, it's about two things. It's about me as a playwright wrestling with my son joining an army and fighting a war that I couldn't finish. So at a personal level, there's that, and the exploration of that. But then there's also, at a contextual level, there was the movement into the war following 9/11, where I know me personally, I was very bent on retribution and walking the enemy down because of the loss of my Ranger buddy Cliff, and then kind of a reawakening for me, and I think others around 2010, that this isn't working and we need to get back to our roots, which was VSO. And then the abandonment, the micro abandonment of those villages in 2012, 2013. That's when I decided to retire. I had already been selected for command 3 times. I turned it down 3 times because I just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. It was that devastating to me. The way that because a lot of my friends who I had personally recruited into that program were killed. And I believe it was a foreshadowing of, what was to come. I tell people all the time, like, if you want to know why Pineapple Express happened, go see Last Out, because, that it tells the story of just, I think, our hubris and our arrogance as a nation to just ignore how local civil society operates. Now, one other thing I want to say about VSO, and it's just really important, is,
sorry, can I jump in? Can y'all define that? That's not an acronym, I know.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So Village Stability Operations Camden was a program that started midway through the Afghan war that was basically like a modern day Magnificent Seven. It involved Green Berets moving back out into the rural areas, donning indigenous garb, putting their, growing their beards out, and living among the local people and helping them stand up on their own, and fighting alongside these locals. And it was almost a form of local militia, which had frankly been at the epicenter of Pashtun civil society in these rural areas for centuries. But we had ignored it. We tried to stand up this, democracy, this liberal democracy in our own image in Afghanistan that frankly just was not appetizing to those folks at all. But local defense, local stability, community engagement was how they've operated for a long time. And for 2010 to 2012, we did that. And we did it very, very well. It had a very profound impact. I wrote a book called Game Changers about it. And then in 2012, for a range of reasons, our politicians and our senior military leaders decided to abandon that program and go back to living in these big built-up fire bases and basically reliance on the Afghan National Army, and that's it. And so we lost control of the rural areas, and the people who had worked with us were hunted and killed as retribution. And so it was to me, a real sad moment in Special Forces history where we got it right, we got it wrong, we got it right, and then we got it wrong again. And then we had the abandonment. What I was going to say to that is if you look back at Vietnam and the CIDG program, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, that's actually where the ideas and strategy for VSO came from. I was fortunate enough to be mentored by some amazing 5th Group NCOs and other Vietnam era NCOs who helped us understand that they had done the same thing with the Montagnards in the central highlands of Vietnam. And the exact same thing happened. It got overloved by the conventional forces. The politicians bailed on it. And these Montagnards faced genocide so badly that a lot of 5th Group NCOs from the Vietnam era are still pulling them out today. So, there's a multi-generational application of Green Berets trying to work with locals. And there's also a multi-generational habit of abandonment by our government and our senior political officials of these locals. So there's this real concerning trend that I see right now in how we fight wars, that we treat, in fact, there's a line in the play where Danny is sitting with an Afghan elder, and he gives, my character Danny Patton, he gives that elder a Kimlight. And the elder says, "Oh, I've seen these. These are light sticks." And he said, "Yeah, give it to your grandson when you get home." And he says, "Well, how do you use it?" And he said, "Well, you break it, you shake it, and you throw it." And he goes, "Okay, what happens when it burns out?" And Danny says, "Oh, it's easy. Just, they're cheap. We got thousands of them. Just leave it where it is and get another one." And Malik John looks at him and says, "I feel a lot like this Kimlight." And I think that is probably pretty accurate to what happened with VSO and a range of other programs over the years. Mm-hmm. And most Americans don't know that. And it's causing a real problem of national security, I think, because not many people in the world trust us much anymore.
Then
No, we do the same thing to the Kurds.
Yes, we sure did.
Those poor folks, we did it to them 3 times.
Yep. Right.
And God bless them for trusting us each time. The second and third time we came back in there.
Can I?
Yeah,
I want to. This is really.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, because this goes back to I think when we actually had. I'm blanking on his last name. Ron Washington that we had on for right after the pullout in Afghanistan. And one of the things we talked about, I might be messing up his name, sorry. But one of the things we talked about,
Ron, but I know you're talking about.
Is the gap. So we were already talking the civilian military gap. And then there's this other gap, and I don't know what kind of shape we're drawing here. We'll have to figure that out at the end of the show. But it's the politics side of it. And because there's the gap between the military and the politics, it seems like there's the gap between the civilians and the politics. And it's such a weird thing because it's so frustrating to learn about because it's so complicated, of course, and there's so many layers to it. But this is the same story we talked about, going on 2 years ago, which was that there seems to be people who have the understanding, who have the skill set, who can make the real change and are trying to make the real change, which is the thing that we all want to believe in. And then there's this disconnect to the top level of leadership where that real change isn't the effort anymore. And so it kind of it poisons the well of the trust and makes those gaps bigger and bigger. And I guess I just want to throw that over to you, Scott, of just what do you think, adding that other piece of the gap there, is that something else that we can address? Do you think that kind of falls into the same stuff we were talking about earlier? What do you think?
I think that's a great observation, Camden. I believe that there is definitely a gap between the leaders and the led. And I mean that at a very senior level. And I've seen this as I work in corporations. I've seen this as I work around government, particularly over the last few years. What we're seeing, and the numbers bear this out, is we're seeing a real drop in institutional trust across America. We've lost trust in the institutions that we normally need for a thriving, functioning liberal democracy. And, most social scientists will agree that if you don't have trust in your institutions that are the stewards of democracy, you have a serious problem on your hands. But I'll give you an example, like the trust in, for example, Congress starting in 1973 was somewhere around, I think it was close to 80%. It dropped to, it's in the single digits in some polls right now. Trust in the media, very, very similar. It started to drop in like 1972, and now it's, very, very low. It's in the teens. And then most recently, really concerning, was a drop. The military has long been, in the war on terror, has been the highest trusted institution in America. It has enjoyed a level of trust in the mid-70s. And now, just days after the Afghanistan withdrawal, it dropped down to 56%, the lowest point that it has been in a very, very long time. And this loss of trust in our institutions, what it for me, like when Pineapple happened and the other volunteer groups, it became apparent to me in a very, very uncomfortable way as that was all happening. The collapse was happening, and we kept thinking, well, somebody from SOCOM is going to pick this up. Somebody from the SF regiment is going to pick these commandos up. We just need to keep them. We just need to keep them on the phone until that we can responsibly hand them off to active duty guys. That never happened. No one ever came. And now I got plenty of phone calls under the table from general officers and admirals and sergeants major asking me to take care of their Afghan. But I got, but there was no formal move. And I get it. It's a policy decision, and, military senior decision makers, their hands were tied. At least that was the lines I got. But I feel like the members of the regiment and members of the special operations community as veterans, we lost a lot of confidence in our senior leaders in the military during that moment, because none of them put their rank on a table. None of them resigned in protest. It just, there was nothing I could do was kind of the answer. We certainly lost trust in our politicians and our policymakers because of decisions that were moral injuries. So, I believe that we're at a point right now in this country where institutional leaders are not showing up for those of us living in the trenches and living the day-to-day, and that it's incumbent on citizens to look at their arena, to look at what's going on, and just recognize nobody's coming. Nobody's coming, and if you're waiting for someone to come riding the horse over the hill, you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment, and you got to ask yourself, okay, how do I lead? How do I step in here? And the last thing I'll say to that, Cam, and I think this is really important, is Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone. He wrote about a time in the early 1900s when America was at a very, very similar place. Polarized politics, infrastructure falling apart, the haves and the have-nots. There was huge disparity. Immigration was out of control, and crime was rampant in the cities. And people were like, hey, America's on her last leg. And it was about that time, two drunks in Akron, Ohio, Dr. Bob and Bill W., looked around after institutional failure and said, nobody's coming, let's have a meeting. And that meeting was later known as Alcoholics Anonymous, and the Rotary Club, the Shriners Club, Future Farmers of America, the NAACP, like every group that your dad and I grew up with was started in this early period of the 1900s. It was the largest and longest running period of social capital and community trust in American history. And it all started from the same kind of thing that you saw with Task Force Dunkirk, Pineapple, groups saying, nobody's coming, we'll lead. And so I don't want to sound pessimistic or negative. I believe that actually we're due for that similar upswing in our country today, but it's going to take activated citizens doing things like Tribe and Purpose to illuminate what leadership looks like and shame these institutional leaders into it so that they follow suit.
All right, now I got to figure out how the heck I wanted to ask this question, because I wanted to touch on Pineapple Express, what you've touched on, but I think it's more to the root of it, and the root of it is, and we talked about this earlier, but is the taking action.
Yeah.
How do the regular Joe, and what's also popping into my mind is we're not talking about January 6th and trying to overthrow. We're not talking about that kind of stuff, folks. We're talking about in the right sense and the systems and the processes
100%.
to do the right thing. What's when you got when the phone when Afghanistan pullout happened and the phone started ringing nonstop. What was it that told you that you decided to say, I'm the one who needs to do something instead of waiting around?
There's a saying in storytelling that what's personal is universal, and for everything in life is personal. And for me, it came down to Nizam, my buddy who was an Afghan commando, Afghan Special Forces, and had gone to our USQ course. And he was at a point where, the Taliban were outside his apartment and he had nowhere else to go. His uncle was about to throw him out because he was compromising their family. He was getting texts from the Taliban, and there was nothing else for him to do. And, I had really avoided at that point getting deeply involved in this because of what we're talking about. I kept saying to myself, this isn't for a bunch of veterans to get involved in. This is the NEO. This is a non-combatant evacuation. This is relief to our partners through the Special Operations Special Forces community. There are active duty dudes that are handling this. And then when Nizam said to me in a phone call on August 15th, he said, "Sir, I'm not afraid to die. Everybody is gone. Our president is gone. Our generals are gone. My friends are gone. I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to die alone." And that was what hit me just right between the running lights, man. It was like, okay, this young man who has given so much, shot through the face defending U.S. troops, shot 3 times in the chest plate doing unilateral ops against ISIS, and, he is going to be left behind to be hunted and killed. For what? For what reason? And so for me, it really came down to all of my friends that I lost in Afghanistan, my youth that I lost in Afghanistan, my buddies like Romy Camargo who are gravely wounded for the rest of their life. It all came down to whether or not this young commando lived or died for me. That was it. I wasn't thinking about pineapple or anything else. And in my interviews with veterans, NCOs, junior officers, Gold Star family members, they all say the same thing. It came down to relationships and connections and the realization that nobody's coming. There's nobody coming. So you're either gonna just roll with it and try to live with it, or try to do something, And for me, I knew I couldn't live with it. I'd already stood in a closet holding a pistol, and I had no intention of going back to that. And I knew, for me personally, if I just shut my mouth and watch this happen and just shake my head from side to side and cuss the universe, I was going to end up back in that closet again. And that's it, and my wife knew it too. And so I think, and the tragedy of that though, is that it was an unwinnable problem. It was as my buddy Duke says in Moral Compass, it was an Uncle Sam sized problem heaped on the backs of our veterans who are trying to solve it with their pension funds and their cell phones. And our population doesn't know any different. Like we're gonna do the right thing because it's the right thing, and it's what we were held to account for decades. So it was a real, as I looked at it, Otis, there was no algorithm or action steps really for this one. It was like, okay, really terrible things are going to happen to my friend if I don't do something, because no one else is going to do anything. And so what do you do in that moment? And I think it goes back to what I was saying, like you said, like this isn't January 6th stuff. This is like, okay, our PTA is in disarray. I'm going to run for the board. Or, our community rec center is a piece of crap. We're going to raise the money to do something. Americans don't understand the cost of modern war. I'm going to write a play. It's veterans are having trouble transitioning. I'm going to start Tribe and Purpose. It's that. And I think it is sorely needed on every level.
Oh, that's awesome, dude. And I appreciate the power of understanding that and sharing that, because, it's something, and I think folks have heard me say this before, but, you raise your hand, this one over here, you raise your hand to support and defend the Constitution. In the heat of the moment, it's the dude to your left and right that you're serving.
Absolutely.
And that's what was happening with you. That's what happened with you when you got that phone call. It went from, watching it on the news and going, damn, this sucks. Like you said, shaking my head, going, somebody's got to do something. I sure hope somebody's doing something. Maybe even knowing, our community and knowing the capabilities, thinking they've got it, they're taking care of it.
Yeah.
But then hearing your buddy's voice is that now it's time. I'm not waiting anymore.
And I tell people all the time, I'm like, okay, that was my Pineapple Express when I looked around that nobody was coming. Last out is my Pineapple Express, but what's yours? Like, and what I mean by that is when you look around your arena and you see that nobody's coming and this thing is broken, what are you building? What are you creating in terms of the collective movement that is necessary to leave this thing better for our kids, better for Cam, and our grandkids. I think that's where we are today. And the problem, the dilemma is, for a range of reasons, we cannot rely on our institutional leaders to get that done. It's just, I think it is a very, very dangerous proposition. Now, can we inspire them and illuminate to them and pressure them to lead responsibly through our own actions? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a very doable thing. And veterans in particular have some very loud voices and can mobilize a lot of people to do amazingly productive things in this country. And we're going to need it in the coming months and years.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, breaking that cycle, because one thing that the reason we raised our hand is because we wanted to serve something bigger than ourselves. And that civil military bridge, that gap that you were talking about, there's so much of the what's in it for me.
Yeah.
And that what's in it for me means that, well, why should I vote? Why should I do this? Why should I care what's happening at the rec center? Why should I care about the PTA? What's in it for me? And in that sense, my favorite thing that I realized very early on as I became more aware of the world is there's a not in my backyard problem also.
Yeah.
And you know what? Your backyard is bigger than that little fenced area or that patio on your apartment.
Yeah, it's true.
It's a lot bigger than that, folks.
Yeah.
So it's time to take action as you think about it.
Yeah. And if we're not careful, we can get sucked into the same tribalism that many of us as Green Berets dealt with in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. There is I call it shadow tribalism, but I believe there is an emerging in-group, out-group behavior that's happening in our civil society today. If you look around, it's not hard to spot. You can see in-groups and out-groups going against each other, like the Alakazai and the Popelazai did in parts of Afghanistan. Like, it's a very real thing, and the reason is because we've allowed ourselves to get so deep into these dopamine dispensers right here, and this represented reality. We've lost our connection with the natural world. We've lost our connection with each other, and in many ways, we're kind of being mobilized into this in-group, out-group behavior. And a lot of our institutional leaders are taking us down that path, whether it's 24-hour news cycle, social media, and politics. And as you said, Otis, I mean, like, it's we can play it straight down the middle, man. We don't have to put a flag in the ground in one camp or the other to have a friggin' conversation about things. And I think that's another thing that we have to, as veterans and as responsible citizens, is we can help bring the emotional temperature down. Like, this loose talk of civil war and all this other crap, like, man, there's just no place for that. That has no usefulness in building a stable community.
I was talking
agree.
with my
I
wife
agree.
yesterday actually about that and just some of her nonprofit work and things that she's seen in the nonprofit industry. And it's how many people in nonprofits who are supposed to be caring, want to help things, how many of them will go, oh, well, you don't believe in my specific
Oh, it's
idea and
vicious.
don't think it's the panacea, so you're an idiot. And then it becomes this super negative thing. And the thing I told her was, it's the same kind of observation that, I probably got it from talking with guys like you on the podcast, but it's that the only way that you can win the game is to not play it. Because they're playing the us versus them game, and as soon as you pick a side, you're dropping down to their level. You can't play that game if you want to play for the long run.
Sebastian Younger says in his book Tribe, which is a great book, and I'm sure you guys know that, but he says that, most veterans have trouble coming home because they're more than willing to die for their country, but they're not sure how to live for it. And he goes on to say it's hard to live for a country that's pulling itself apart at every level across political lines, religious lines, ethnic lines. And he says, Americans today speak of each other with contempt, normally reserved for one's enemies. And when we speak with contempt, or as you said, Cam, moral superiority over another human or another group, we are in effect practicing shadow tribalism. And as righteous as we think we are, and as justified as we think our position is, if we are using contempt or moral superiority, we are on a path to tribalism and ultimately organizational collapse and violence. And we have to exercise the kind of restraint that is necessary to not speak that way, because it takes us as humans down a primal path that is so predictable. But yet it's almost like we're in a trance as we're doing it. And like you said, man, we just can't play that game.
I'm gonna round this out with what I learned, with more of a foot stomper than what I learned, because the point of this, folks, ain't doom and gloom. The point of this is it rests in your hands. It's in your cup of coffee. It's in your backyard. It's in your refrigerator. It's on your TV. If you got your TV on, it doesn't matter where it is, but it's up to you to make the change. It's up to you to bridge the gap. There's nobody coming. As you said, there ain't nobody coming. So it is our opportunity to take the action and make the change and make the difference. And I think that is a great reminder that I'm counting as what I learned today. Camden, how about you?
Had just about the same thing written out, but I think, just to add on, there's whatever your savior thing is, if you're, the capitalist who is like, oh, the businesses will come up with better solutions and will solve problems. If you're somebody who loves politics and you're like, we just need to elect the right president and then everything, whatever your thing is, it's okay to have that and to put energy towards it, but you also got to recognize that there's no savior coming in that. There's no political savior. There's no, business savior. It's going to take a little bit of effort from all of those different areas. And yeah, nobody's coming. The best thing you can do is to build trust in your own environment, start to bridge those gaps. And then, like we talked about probably 100 freaking times on the show, Dad, if you do a good job and it looks good, then it's modeling and people will follow you. And then you can build it more and more and more. And then, hey, does that solve every freaking problem? I don't know, but it's a good start at the very least, right?
Awesome. Scott, how about you, man?
I think for me, it's what you guys are doing. I mean, I think you guys are modeling it. I spend a lot of time in the civil society space with people who are building movements. And you can always tell the people who are actually building movements. And Americans love, love, love leaders who build things. We love it. We love leaders who build things. And you guys just being on here as a father and son, you guys in here talking about and modeling for us what leadership looks like at a multi-generational level. And not just for veterans, but for anybody that's wanting to make an impact. It really, as a father of three boys who are, making their way in the world, it just demonstrates to me, as you said, Otis, it's not doom and gloom. It's look, we all have an inherent responsibility to lead our communities and lead our civil societies, and to just rest this at the feet of our institutional leaders. One, it's lazy anyway, and most of the things that have happened in this country through precedent have happened at a community-based level. And I think what you guys are doing is like just proof positive of that. And so it really is cool for me to just see it in action. And again, I think it just reaffirms to me that that's how it's going to get done. And I'm actually very optimistic. I really am. I think our best days are in front of us. I look at guys like Camden and my sons Cody, Cooper, and Braden. We're in good hands, man. We're in good hands. Like, we just need to be there for them and let them lead. And I think today's evidence of that.
Oh yeah, no, that's awesome. How do folks find you, Scott? Follow you? What's the schedule of Last Out? That's what I really want to share.
Well, I would say the first thing, if you want to just, I have a pretty crazy body of work on the for-profit, nonprofit side. Rooftop leadership, where we want 10 million inspired rooftop leaders using human connection in 10 years. On the Hero's Journey side is helping 100,000 veterans tell their story. So, and then the play, Last Out, is taking this thing all over the country. If you go to scottmann.com, that's the easiest way to see all of it. Like, it's all arrayed there, scottmann.com. The play is actually going to pick back up in May. We're going to be starting off in San Diego, May 5 through 6, and then June we're going to be in Phoenix. July, we're going to be in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. August, we're going to be in Nashville, Tennessee. September, we're going to be in Milwaukee. In October, we're going to be in Topeka. All those tour stops are on scottmann.com, or if you go to lastoutplay.com, they'll be posted there very soon. We're just wrapping up the tour stops. And then we'll probably get to some other places too, but those are the next 6.
That's awesome. And good memory. Good memory. I'll give you full credit for remembering that. Whether or not you're looking at it on the board or not.
No, I'm not. But I appreciate the support on that, Otis. And I do hope people will go to the play. Whether you served in the military or not, it's actually to help inform civilians on the cost of modern war, and also to help veterans and military families make meaning out of this long war. The best way to go see this play, man, is to either go with your family and sit as a family, or even with your neighbors, those who didn't serve. If you're a veteran, and if you're a civilian, take a veteran with you, and then go have the conversations afterwards. This is our emotional breaching tool to open up the hard conversations around war that we need to have as a civil society.
Oh, that's awesome. And I'll, having not seen it live, but watched it, brother, you're hitting it.
Thank you, man.
You're nailing it, man.
You got to see it live. You got to see it live.
Yeah. That's why I'm asking. I didn't hear Colorado Springs or Denver.
We heard Phoenix though. Come down here in June. Yeah. Let's go, Dad.
I did hear Phoenix. That's right.
Bring a fan with you.
So that's now on my list.
And let me know if you're coming, and we'll make sure we take good care of you guys.
No, that'd be awesome. Brother, it has been great, man. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sharing your time with us today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, guys. God bless.
Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to the Cam and Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guest, Scott Mann, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass it along to someone else so they can enjoy it too. Make sure to follow the Cam and Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And while you're there, make sure you hit that subscribe button too. As always, the full archive of our episodes is available at www.camandotisshow.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.